Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the forum for the webinar of the next of our tiered preparedness and response wheel webinar series at sea containment and recovery. You will hear from Ian High, response specialist and member of our subject matter expert group of Offshore. This seminar will be recorded and made available on our website in the technical library. If you have questions for Ian during the presentation, please pop them in the chat function and Ian will come to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand you over to Ian.
Thanks very much, Emma. Good day, everyone. Thanks again for the intro and welcome to this next segment of the TPR wheel series. Today we're going to give an overview, as mentioned, of the at-sea and containment and recovery segment of the tiered preparedness and response wheel. So what is containment and recovery? So at-sea containment and recovery is the controlled encounter and collection of oil from the water surface. Equipment is used to corral and concentrate the spilled oil using floating barriers or booms, as they're more commonly known as, on the sea surface into a suitable surface thickness, allowing for a mechanical removal or recovery. So the key components of a containment and recovery system are, as we've mentioned, a boom or barrier to encounter the oil and contain, a recovery device, and most commonly used as a skimmer, and a pump to transfer the collected oil and water mixture into a temporary storage or collection area. But first, let's start by having a look at the TPR wheel, as mentioned in previous series seminars. So as we've seen from the TPR introduction presentation, the blue, green and grey demarcations within each slice represent the different tiers of the response. So as mentioned, the tier 1 highlighted as the dark blue. You can see a small section there for the at-sea containment and recovery. Indicates the resources required immediately to handle a local spill and or provide the initial response. The tier 2, highlighted as the green, as mentioned, is the national or regional resource necessary to supplement the tier 1 response. But tier 3, highlighted as in this case the big grey section, is the global resource necessary for spills that require a substantial additional resource due to the incident scale, the complexity, or the impact potential. But as mentioned, as shown for the majority of at-sea containment and recovery response, it would be heavily reliant on a global, larger scale support and resources. But firstly, at-sea containment and recovery operations are inherently hazardous, and measures should be put in place to protect response personnel. Risks to the health and safety of personnel, such as operating near water, exposure to all the elements, are typical for any offshore operation, but they are definitely exacerbated by the conditions faced during containment and recovery at sea. Additional items or hazards like slippery decks, trip hazards caused by trailing hoses or additional equipment on deck, lines under high tension is a massive consideration, and working long hours under high pressure all impose additional hazards to crews and response operations and teams. Floating oil can also present inhalation, fire and explosion hazards, depending on the volatility of the oil and the state of weathering. So ensuring the safety of all is absolute #1 priority at all times. So let's start with the containment section. You get a few different types of offshore containment booms. So one example is a passive boom. So it's an inflation boom generally used for offshore activities. as it has better wave following characteristics than a rigid boom would. There are many different makes of this offshore boom. However, the principles are the same. The passive boom is relatively easy to deploy and maintain. It's ideally suited to spills where it may be necessary to deploy or recover the boom relatively frequently, as the vessels so-called chase the oil on a daily basis. To complete the system, you would need to source a suitable recovery system in addition to this. Okay, then something slightly different is what we call an active boom system. So an active boom system incorporates a pump within the actual boom structure at the apex of the boom. Thus it's both a containment and a recovery device. The recovery device is incorporated, as mentioned, into the apex of the boom. Relatively easy to ensure that the recovery device is kept in an optimal position. Active booms are generally designed with high recovery rates, and they're best suited to situations such as well blowouts or pipeline failures, purely because the vessel is able to stay at station or in position in and around the same area for prolonged periods of time with the boom permanently deployed. Active boom is more complicated to deploy, more technical, and harder to maintain and repair than the passive boom. Another type of boom system or further is the current buster. You get different sizes or variances. We current buster 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. These systems have an advantage of being able to be towed quicker than the traditional booms just previously mentioned. These booms are able to be towed between 4 and 5 knots as opposed to 1 knot, for example. Because it can be towed quicker, but therefore has a higher encounter rate, so incorporates separator, reducing the amount of water and maximizing the amount of oil that is recovered. The vessel indicated to recover from the boom is generally required an additional vessel at the apex, as it's traditionally a considerable distance, as you can see in the pictures, distance away from the towing vessels. So another issue with, or not issue, but another point is that they are prone to collect debris, which could interfere with the ability to recover oil. Okay, so just a little bit more on containing the oil with our boom configurations, or a few different versions of the boom configuration. So starting from the left, we look at the J formation. And as you can see, the positive and negative points on the slide. The first point in the J formation is obviously simultaneous containment and recovery. So you're able to do the multiple operations simultaneously. Although it's a smaller encounter due to the, as you can see there, the little picture, the left vessel needs to be closer to the collected oil before recovery. Next is the U formation, as you can see, slightly wider encounter, a lot more difficult to coordinate. Now you've got 3 vessels. There's a wider boom apex, as you can see there, for more difficult positioning and recovery device to optimize oil and minimize water recovery. And as mentioned, more demand on resources and logistics, as you can well imagine. Similar to the V formation, decent wider encounter for oil, narrowing apex, which aids in collecting, assists in maximizing the amount of oil recovered. And as you can see, the picture gives a good idea or example of that. To the right of that is the side sweep, which is another version. As mentioned, less demand logistics because it's now 1 vessel, not 3, for example. It's quick to deploy, so it's much easier, more maneuverability, and it's much easier to maintain. The only elements there, as it says, small encounter, and you may have less collection or deck space operation allowable. Then the very last picture on the right is a single vessel system using a paravane. If the availability of vessels is limited, then a paravane can be deployed in lieu of a second towing vessel or an outrigger, as the side sweep shows. The paravane is attached to the far end of the boom, and its position in the water is controlled from the vessel by a single mooring line. This enables the boom to be guided into an optimal position to encounter the oil. Okay, so a bit on moving off from the containment and moving into recovery. Some ideas, examples there. So to start off from the left, we have a few type of recovery devices. First one, as you can see, is the oilophilic skimmer, and they particularly could use belts, brushes, discs, or drums, or ropes, which have the ophilic oil-loving properties, as we call it. The oilophilic surface picks up the oil, which is then removed by scrapers or pumped into storage. The oilophilic nature of the material captures oil by adhesion, and these skimmers have recovery efficiencies of approximately 90% oil, 10% water. Oil viscosities will play a critical factor in deciding the type of skimmer to be used in the response. Also important to note that the oilophilic skimmers do not work on oil that has been treated with a dispersant. Mainly suitable for light to medium oils, and then moving on. Sorry, next picture in the middle with the bright orange, the weir skimmers. Oil flows over a simple weir lip by gravity and collected in a sump. That's then transferred via discharge hose and to the storage. Suitable again for light to medium oil. Tends to have high water recovery in choppy seas. Works best with thick slicks in calm waters. Again, detergents will not be affected, won't affect the recovery as the oilophilic skimmers do. And another hindrance is potentially could get clogged with debris. Then moving to the right side of the slide, the brush skimmers, suitable for medium oils, and they do essentially what it says on the tin, grabbing and brushing the oil into collection for pumping to storage. Moving on to something, or mechanical skimmer, something more aggressive. So they typically removes the oil from the water surface by the use of nets, drums, or conveyor belts. As the top picture shows, a tooth skimmer or sometimes crane-operated buckets, as you can see on the right. Not suitable for light oils. It tolerates debris, as you can imagine, and recovers suitable emulsions as well. Efficiency of skimmers in oil spill depends on several factors. For example, the operating environment, such as the sea state, the type of oil, the slick thickness, such as viscosity, then also the degree of emulsification that has taken place. More elements could be the operator skill, the debris handling capacity, and the pump and the flow rate of that pump. So moving on, now that we've discussed containment and recovery, I'd just like to touch on a few potential challenges with at-sea containment and recovery. So one of the big challenges that sometimes is overlooked is what is the value of going out and trying to contain and recover spilt product if there's nowhere to store or pump the collected product to? So one of the first main challenges is temporary waste storage. So as you can see in the pictures, for example, from the left is intermediate bulk containers, or IBCs, or barrels could be used. They typically plastic containers with a cubic capacity of around 1 to 2 cubes and surrounded by a metal frame, so it can be stored and secured easily on deck. The IBCs take up a valuable space on the deck, though, which is the downside, and they have a limited capacity. So moving on to the middle picture, looks like a little boat there. It's an inflatable storage. They inflatable storage barges with a plastic skirt floating below. They typically have a much larger capacity than the IBCs, of up to about 50 cubes. And they're floating, so they're floating storage bladders, also available that can be rolled up for storage before deployment, and on the water surface, where they will expand and they can be, and as recovered liquids are pumped into it, transferred from the skimmers, the storage barges are susceptible to damage. That's the only issue with them, not only, but and this could lead to a loss of product or recovered oil. And another potential hindrance with this is the maneuverability of the towing vessel. They might be further restricted due to the proximity of the storage barges or bladders. Special arrangements may also need to be made for the recovery of the barge at the port or harbour once the bladder has been filled. Then another issue with that is that due to the large bladder or draft of the barges, it prevents their use in shallower waters. Just a simple picture of the vessels there, but to depict vessel tanks or tanker vessels. These are towing vessels that will work in an operation. They have their own internal storage tanks as another potential option. The capacity will vary, as you can imagine, the size of the vessel, and oil can be stored internally on board the towing vessel without having to source temporary storage. Some vessels have heated tanks, which also could aid to reduce the viscosity of the oil. Vessels' internal storage systems may not comply with regulatory requirements for the handling of recovered oil, so this could pose an issue. And also sometimes vessel owners are not always willing to have oil stored or pumped into their onboard tanks. So a few more challenges just to highlight for consideration. So further availability, as you can read, for logistical support. Restricted area for operations, I've got on there, for example, if you have a whole lot of IBCs on the back of the deck, it limits your space or working space or area able to work, especially if you've got a whole lot of equipment tied down on deck. As you can see in the picture on the right is minimizing secondary contaminations. Obviously another challenge wherever you are in an oil spill or recovering any product. It can quickly become an issue that grows legs very fast. As mentioned with the bladders, the ability of vessels to tow and maneuver at low speeds. Sometimes you have a lovely vessel, but it's unable to tow and maneuver at low speeds. A big factor is the environmental conditions, as mentioned before, so the sea state, the current, or the wind, that all plays a large factor with regards to containing and recovering oil. offshore temporary storage capacity versus your skimmer recovery rates, as mentioned. So you could have these lovely big skimmers and equipment to recover product once it's contained, but you're unable to store the quantities that are being recovered. Becomes a problem very, very quickly. Competent personnel to operate equipment. You can put a whole lot of equipment on the back deck of a vessel, but if it's not operated professionally or correctly, then that could pose a lot more hazards than actual effective response recovery. I've got on there limited field of vision. That could be caused, I'll show you a picture in the next slide, but low height of above sea level or poor weather like fog or mist. Well, that brings me on to the next one, which is effective operational communication. This is another big challenge. If this doesn't go correctly or smoothly, things or your operation at sea with containment and recovery could be nowhere near as effective or efficient as hoped. And this coordination of SIMOPS is vital for your daily success of containment and recovery operations. So, in summary, as you can see the few points there, offshore containment recovery can be a useful response strategy and will be most successful with these few key elements based on the slides that we've discussed. So suitable recovery devices for the type and weather conditions or the environment. The boom selected must be well maintained and deployed by competent personnel. Communications extremely effective and clear amongst all the parties involved, and suitable storage. If that's not available, your operation will come to a grinding halt very quickly. So just to close off with brief guidance to good practice guides for further reading. It can be found on the PICA website, the at-sea containment and recovery guide, as well as some of OSRL's operational field guides are available as well. And then just a note to say thank you very much for your time and for listening to the presentation. And a little hint on the right for the next upcoming series presentation is the shoreline cleanup by Marcus Russell on the 16th of June. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian. We do have a couple of questions here for you. So the first question is, are vacuum systems, pump systems deployed offshore?
Sorry, can you say that again, Emma, please?
Are vacuum systems, pump systems deployed offshore?
Yes, they can be, depending on the size, the structure of what's available offshore as well. But yes, it definitely can be situational dependent.
The second question is, how can we determine the correct oil spill response equipment requirements for offshore or inshore oil operations?
Well, that's a very good question. It's key to understand the product that you're working with. It's critical to get that information as soon as possible so that hopefully the correct choices can be made for equipment selection. There is a large amount of equipment that could deal with various types of product, but it's imperative to understand what the product is so that you can make the correct choices. But yeah, if you're dealing with the incorrect product, you could definitely get it wrong on the day with the incorrect equipment.
The last question is about the capping stacks and whether they are included in this part of the wheel.
To answer that, no. I believe the capping stacks are part of the subsea element of the wheel, and this was purely the on the at-sea surface containment and recovery.
And that's all the questions in the chat.
Okay, brilliant.
So if there aren't any further questions, I'll just thank everybody for their time and look forward to seeing you all at the next one.
Thanks very much, everyone. Just closing the presentation and it shut everything down by accident.
I'm actually not sure how many people are left, but I'm going to read them out anyway. What types of boom and recover systems are in your container system?
In our container system, we have various types of booms in the containment system, but they can also be custom made, if I'm correct in saying. So there are various. So there are row boom, there's high sprint. There are various and definitely custom made as required.
And then the final question is, in your experience, do solid flotation booms perform better under heavy wind situations than inflated ones?
From experience, no, I don't believe they do, because depending on the height of the boom configuration, whether it's solid or inflatable, you know, the failures will be very similar in my experience. So no, if the weather is bad, for example, high winds, no, there wouldn't be much difference. I prefer the inflatable.
Okay, thank you. Right, we will call it an end now because we've reached the end of the time. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, no problem. Thanks very much. Thank you, Emma.
Bye-bye.